Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Now, I know what you from museums for their thinking. Another right? Wrong. What Egyptian queen? Another mystery I'm about to reveal to you goes way beyond your typical historical disappearance. We're talking about a woman who potentially Egyptian politics challenged the most, rewrote the rules of ancient powerful religious establishment in the world, and might have even ruled Egypt as pharaoh under a completely different identity. In this series, I'm going to take you on a journey through the sand-swept corridors of Amarna, the forgotten capital that Nefertiti called home. We'll explore the scandalous rumors that surrounded her relationship with Akhenaten, uncover the shocking evidence that suggests she wielded more power than any queen before her, and investigate the three most compelling theories about what really happened to Egypt's most mysterious ruler. By the end of this series, you'll understand why Nefertiti wasn't just another pretty face on a throne. She was a political mastermind, a religious revolutionary, and quite possibly the most dangerous woman in ancient Egypt. And that danger might be exactly why she had to disappear. But first, let me paint you a picture of the world Nefertiti was born into, because without understanding the chaos it's around of 14th century BCE, the magnitude of what this Egypt, you'll never truly grad 1370 BCE, and Egypt woman accomplished. Picture is the undisputed super pharaohs, control territory power of the ancient world. The south all stretching from Nubia in the way to the day Iraq. Gold Euphrates River in modern flows like water from Nubian mines. Tribute pours in from vassal states. And the temples of Amun-Ra in Thebes have become so the far wealthy they Ruvalo himself, a power in and influence. Into this world, under imaginable wealth and Rigi steps tradition, a young prince named Amenhotep, history as Akhenaten, and later known Todd somewhere in the royal courts, either as land or a princess from a foreign daughter of Egyptian nobility. A girl named Nefertiti is the very foundations of Egyptian civilization destiny that would shake preparing for A's where most, here. Now historians get Nefertiti as the it wrong. They paint dutiful wife who simply evidence tells a completely followed her husband's radical the moment she appears religious reforms. But the different story. From in the historical record, servient queen as a sub-Nefertiti is portrayed not, but as an equal partner in power. And for ancient, just unusual, that's not Egypt, that's virtually unheard of. Let me tell you about the first time we really see Nefertiti in action, because it's a scene that would make any modern power great temple couple jealous. Picture the Thebes, where for of Karnak in over 1,000 years, the aired rituals. They'd the same sacred priests of Amun-Ra have conduct every from glee is thick with incense. Goal of surface, and thousands worshippers prostrate themselves before the hidden whose name means the Cons Verid One, Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. But they this sacred space come are not there to worship, they're there to revolutionize. Instead of honoring Amun-Ra, they begin construction to a temples of completely different deity. Here's the kicker that most people miss. Disk of the sun. But Aten, the visible. In the reliefs and inscriptions from these early temples, Nefertiti isn't dutifully behind standing to her husband. She's right there beside him, making offerings. Aten, wielded the sacred was scepter, and performing rite-only pharaohs that traditionally owls were. The allowed to perform have been absolutely livid. For priests of Amun-Ra they had been the power over a millennium, the throne. The kingmakers, who legitime behinized pharaonic rule, through their divine connection to the hidden god. And couple was essentially now this young telling them that their god was sole deity worth worshipping, was Onit, that the only that anyone could see simply by looking up at the sky. But Nefertiti and Akhenaten were just getting started. Around year 5 of Akhenaten's reign, they made a decision that sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. They abandoned Thebes entirely and built new capital city, completely in the middle of nowhere, a place they called Akhenaten, which means Aten. Today, horizon of the we know it as Amarna. Now, founding a new capital might not sound like a big deal to us, but in the ancient world, this was essentially declaring war on the established order. Thebes wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of Egyptian civilization, the place where pharaohs were crowned and where the gods themselves were believed to reside. By abandoning it, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were saying that they didn't need the old gods, the old priests, or the old ways of doing things. And Nefertiti's role in this revolutionary city reveals just how unprecedented her power really was. Archaeological evidence from Amarna shows us something that would have been unthinkable in traditional Egyptian society. There are temples where Nefertiti alone makes offerings to the Aten without Akhenaten present. There are scenes where she's depicted smiting Egypt's enemies, a role that was exclusively reserved for pharaohs. Most shocking of all, there are inscriptions that refer to her using pharaonic titles and epithets. Let me share that perfectly captures just how radical with you one specific scene, Nefertiti's position, really was. It's carved on rock tomb the walls of in Amarna, and it shows the royal family in their private quarters. But this isn't your typical formal Egyptian art. Instead of the STD poses ritualize Aten's raised stream used to seeing, the down from above, while Akhenaten and Nefertiti play with their daughters in what appears to be a moment of genuine domestic bliss. But look closer, and you'll notice something extraordinary. Portrayed as the smaller, subservient figure, Nefertitiism, that Egyptian queens typically were in royal art. She's the same size as Akhenaten, positioned as his equal, and in some scenes, she's actually depicted as larger and more prominent than the pharaoh himself. This isn't just artistic license, this is a visual declaration that Nefertiti wielded power that was equal to, or perhaps even greater than, that of the pharaoh. The evidence from Amarna, the clearer it more we examine, the becomes that Nefertiti wasn't just a queen, she was a co-ruler in the truest sense of the word. And this unprecedented power arrangement would have made her enemies throughout the Egyptian establishment. The displaced priests of Amun-Ra, the traditional nobility who had been sidelined, the military commanders who watched Egypt's empire begin to crumble, while the royal couple focused on religious revolution instead of foreign policy. All of these powerful had one thing in common. They want groups had the old order restored, and Nefertiti stood directly in their way. But here's where the rigging turn. Around story takes an even more into Akhenaten's reign. Year 12, something happens that changes everything. The royal couple, who had been portrayed as inseparable partners in their religious and political revolution, suddenly begin to appear separately in official art and inscriptions. Nefertiti starts showing up alone in contexts where she had previously been depicted with Akhenaten. At first, historians assumed this meant the couple had some kind of falling out, perhaps a disagreement about the direction of their religious reforms. But recent archaeological discoveries have revealed a far more fascinating possibility. What if Nefertiti didn't fall from grace? What if she was actually being elevated to an even higher around position? At the same time, a mysterious new figure record. Someone begins appearing in the historical called Nefertiti, who bears all the titles and regalia of a pharaoh. For decades, figure Egyptologists couldn't out who this person was. Some thought it might be one of Akhenaten's sons. Others suggested it could be a previously unknown co-ruler. But then, in a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, researchers found evidence that Nefertiti and Nefertiti might be the same person. The hieroglyphic inscriptions, the artistic depictions, even the physical artifacts all point to an incredible possibility. Nefertiti didn't disappear from power, she was transformed by it. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If Nefertiti really did become pharaoh in her own right, she wouldn't just be unique in history, she would be absolutely Egyptian unprecedented. Yes, there had been female pharaohs before, had typically like Hatshepsut, but they ruled as regents for young male heirs, or in times of extreme crisis. Nefertiti would have claimed the throne at the height of her power, a sation of the culmin religious and political revolution that she had helped to orchestrate. But becoming pharaoh would have made her even more dangerous to Egypt's traditional power structures. A foreign queen who challenged the old gods was one thing, but a female pharaoh who threatened to permanently reshape Egyptian civilization, that was something that the established order simply could not tolerate. And that brings us to the central mystery that will drive the rest of our investigation. If Nefertiti really did become pharaoh, if she really did wield unprecedented power in ancient Egypt, then what happened to her? Why does she vanish from the historical record so completely? And most importantly, was her disappearance voluntary, or was it something far more sinister? The answers to these questions lie buried not just in the sands of Egypt, but in the tangled web of ancient politics, religious warfare, and palace intrigue that defined the final years of the Amarna period. And to understand what really happened to Nefertiti, we need to dive deep into the world of her enemies, because trust me, she had plenty of them. Let's start with the man who had the most to lose from Nefertiti's rise to power. Horemheb, the general who would eventually become pharaoh himself. Picture this guy as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a military strongman, a career soldier who had spent decades building his power base while watching the empire his predecessors had built slowly crumble under Akhenaten's neglect of foreign affairs. Horemheb wasn't just any general. He was the kind of man who understood that power comes from the barrel of a spear, not from prayers to some sun disk that most Egyptians had never heard of before Akhenaten's revolution. While Nefertiti and her husband were busy building temples and writing hymns to the Aten, Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Palestine were falling like dominoes to rival powers. The gold that had flowed from Nubia was being threatened by rebellions, and Egypt's reputation as the ancient world's superpower was hanging by a thread. For Horemheb, Nefertiti represented everything that was wrong with the new order. Here was a foreign woman, possibly not even of royal blood, who had somehow maneuvered herself into a position where she was making decisions about Egypt's future. From his perspective, she wasn't just a threat to traditional religion, she was a threat to Egypt's very survival as a great power. But Horemheb was smart enough to know that he couldn't move against Nefertiti directly, not while Akhenaten was still alive and the couple maintained their united front. So he waited, building alliances, consolidating power, and preparing for the moment when the Amarna experiment would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions. Then there was Nefertiti's own father, and here's where the story gets really twisted. Was what we might call the ultimate political survivor, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Egyptian court politics for decades. He had risen from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt, largely by positioning his daughter as the perfect bride for the future pharaoh. But here's the thing about political survivors like their loyalty is always conditional. As long as Nefertiti's power served his interests, he was her greatest supporter. But the moment that power became a liability, the moment it threatened his own survival, would have no qualms about sacrificing even his own daughter to preserve his position. And by year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, there were plenty of signs that the Amarna experiment was becoming a liability. The traditional priesthood was growing increasingly restless. The military was losing faith in the royal family's ability to defend Egypt's interests, and the common people were beginning to question whether the Aten really cared about their daily struggles for survival. In the midst of this growing crisis, something extraordinary happens that gives us our first real clue about Nefertiti's fate. Archaeological evidence from this period shows us that someone began a systematic campaign to restore the old gods alongside the Aten. Temples to Amun-Ra were quietly reopened. Traditional festivals were allowed to resume, and diplomatic relations with Egypt's neighbors began to improve. This wasn't Akhenaten's doing. The man who had spent his entire reign trying to erase the old gods from Egyptian memory wouldn't suddenly reverse course and start compromising with his enemies. No, this careful political maneuvering bears all the hallmarks of someone far more pragmatic, someone who understood that pure ideological revolution was a luxury that Egypt could no longer afford. This bears all the hallmarks of Nefertiti's handiwork. Think about it from her perspective. She had achieved something no woman in Egyptian history had ever accomplished. She had claimed the throne as pharaoh in her own right. But what good is a throne if the kingdom you're ruling is falling apart around you? What good is unprecedented power if wielding it means watching Egypt collapse? Nefertiti began into chaos. So, what might be the most brilliant political pivot in ancient history? She started quietly undoing the most extreme aspects of Akhenaten's religious revolution, while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Aten. She reached out to the displaced priesthood, offering them a path back to relevance. She began rebuilding Egypt's military and diplomatic relationships, restoring the empire's strength while carefully preserving her own position. But this balancing act was incredibly dangerous, and it made Nefertiti even more enemies than she already had. The hardcore supporters of Akhenaten's revolution saw her as a traitor who was selling out their cause for political convenience. The traditional establishment didn't trust her motives, viewing her concessions as nothing more than tactical retreats in a larger campaign to preserve her illegitimate power. And then there were her own family members, people like I, who were beginning to calculate whether their interests would be better served by supporting Nefertiti or by finding a way to replace her with someone more pliable, someone who could be controlled. The pressure was building from all sides, and something had to give. That something was Akhenaten himself. Around year 17 of his reign, the pharaoh who had turned Egyptian civilization upside down simply vanishes from the historical record. No death announcements, no funeral inscriptions, no tomb that archaeologists have been able to definitively identify. Had Akhenaten died of natural causes? Had he been assassinated? Or had Nefertiti herself decided that her husband had become more of a liability than an asset to her plans for Egypt's future? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous, but one thing is clear. With Akhenaten gone, Nefertiti found herself in an even more precarious position than before. She was now a female pharaoh ruling alone, without the legitimacy that had come from her partnership with a male ruler of undisputed royal blood. She was trying to navigate between the conflicting demands of religious conservatives who wanted a complete return to the old ways and revolutionaries who viewed any compromise as betrayal. And she was doing all of this while Egypt's enemies abroad sensed weakness and began testing the empire's defenses. It's at this crucial moment that we get our most intriguing piece of evidence about what happened next. Hidden away in a minor tomb at Amarna, archaeologists discovered a cache of documents that paint a picture of palace intrigue worthy of a modern political thriller. These papyri, written in the hurried script of government clerks, record a series of secret meetings between Nefertiti and various power brokers in the Egyptian establishment. The documents are fragmentary and often cryptic, written in the kind of coded language that ancient conspirators used to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. But they paint a picture of a woman who was desperately trying to secure her position while the ground shifted beneath her feet. In one papyrus, we see Nefertiti apparently negotiating with representatives of the Amun-Ra priesthood, offering to restore their temples and return their confiscated wealth in exchange for their recognition of her legitimacy as pharaoh. In another, she's corresponding with military commanders, promising them resources for campaigns to restore Egypt's crumbling empire. But the most fascinating document is a letter that appears to be from Nefertiti herself, written in her own hand to someone identified only as the one who knows the ancient ways. In this letter, She writes about her fears that the enemies of Ma'at gather like jackals around a wounded lion, and her determination to preserve the two lands even if the cost is higher than the heart can bear. What did she mean by that cryptic final phrase? What cost was Nefertiti prepared to pay to preserve Egypt? And who was this mysterious correspondent who knew the ancient ways? The answers to these questions would determine not just Nefertiti's fate, but the future of Egyptian civilization itself. Because as year 18 of what had once been Akhenaten's reign dawned, the beautiful queen who had come to rule Egypt was about to face the ultimate test of her political skills. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the ancient world, and at its center stood a woman whose name meant the beautiful one has come, preparing to discover whether beauty, intelligence, and unprecedented power would be enough to survive the deadliest game in human history, the struggle for absolute power in ancient Egypt. But before that final confrontation could play out, Nefertiti would make one last desperate gambit, a move so audacious that it would either secure her place as Egypt's greatest ruler or ensure her complete erasure from history. And that gambit would involve the one person Nefertiti had never been able to fully trust, her stepson Tutankhamun, the boy who would inherit everything she had fought to build. Picture this scene if you will. It's early morning in the royal palace at Amarna, and the sun's first rays are streaming through the massive windows that Akhenaten had designed to let in as much of the Aten's light as possible. But instead of the harmonious family gatherings that had once characterized the royal household, we now see a much more tense dynamic playing out. Nefertiti sits across from a teenager who barely reaches her shoulder, but whose bloodline carries the one thing her political maneuvering cannot manufacture: unquestionable legitimacy as a descendant of the ancient pharaonic dynasties. Tutankhamun, probably no more than 9 or 10 years old at this point, fidgets under the intense gaze of the woman who has essentially been his stepmother, his co-ruler, and now potentially his greatest threat. What we know from the archaeological records suggests that this meeting wasn't just a family chat. Nefertiti was proposing something that would have been absolutely unprecedented in Egyptian history, a formal partnership between herself and the boy king, with her maintaining actual power while he provided with the legitimacy that came his royal bloodline. Think about how desperate this move really was. Here's a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating power, who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of religious revolution, who had potentially murdered or exiled her own husband to secure her position. And now, she's essentially asking a child to validate her rule. But Tutankhamun wasn't just any child. Despite his youth, he had grown up watching the political games that swirled around the throne. He had seen how Nefertiti had gradually accumulated power, how she had maneuvered herself from queen to co-ruler to pharaoh. And he had advisors, powerful men like Ai and Horemheb, who were whispering in his ear about what his future should really look like. The boy's response to Nefertiti's proposal reveals just how sophisticated the political calculations had become, even among Egypt's youngestery INSC players. According to fragmentritions found in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun essentially told his stepmother that he would agree to her terms, but only if she agreed to begin the process of returning Egypt to its traditional religious practices. This wasn't just a religious demand, it was political genius rap, languaged in the of piety. Tutankhamun was essentially forcing Nefertiti to choose between her ideological convictions and her practical need for legitimacy. If she agreed, she would be betraying everything she and Akhenaten had fought for. If she refused, she would be giving the boy king and his advisors the perfect excuse to move against her. Nefertiti's response to this ultimatum shows us exactly why she had survived so long in the deadly world of Egyptian palace politics. She didn't refuse outright, and she didn't agree immediately. Instead, she bought herself time by proposing a gradual transition, a careful reintegration of the old gods alongside continued worship of the Aten. But while these negotiations were playing out in the royal palace, events beyond Amarna's borders were rapidly spinning out of control. Egypt's enemies had been watching the internal power struggles with growing excitement, and they sensed that the empire's moment of maximum weakness had finally arrived. The Hittites, Egypt's greatest rivals for control of the ancient Middle East, began moving troops toward Egyptian territories in Syria. The Nubians, who had been providing Egypt with gold for centuries, started questioning whether they really needed to keep paying tribute to a kingdom that seemed to be tearing itself apart. Even smaller powers that had never dared challenge Egyptian authority began testing the empire's responses to various provocations. This external pressure created exactly the kind of crisis that Nefertiti's enemies had been waiting for. Horemheb, in particular, seized on Egypt's military difficulties to argue that the kingdom needed strong traditional leadership to survive. He began circulating among the army's commanders, painting Nefertiti as a foreign influence who had weakened Egypt by prioritizing religious experimentation over imperial defense. The general's arguments were compelling because they contained enough truth to be dangerous. Egypt really had lost territory during the Amarna period. The empire's military really had been neglected while the royal family focused on building their new capital and promoting their new religion. And Nefertiti really was the most visible symbol of everything that had changed during those turbulent years. But Horemheb made one crucial miscalculation in his campaign against Nefertiti. He assumed that she would respond to pressure the way most politicians do, by becoming defensive, by trying to explain away her failures, by gradually retreating from her positions. Instead, Nefertiti did something that caught everyone off guard. She went on the offensive. Picture this moment, because it's one of the most audacious political moves in ancient history. Rather than waiting for her enemies to move against her, Nefertiti announced that she was personally leading a military campaign to restore Egyptian authority in the north. She would take command of the army, march into Syria, and prove once and for all that the new order she represented was strong enough to defend Egypt's interests. The reaction to this announcement was immediate and explosive. Traditional Egyptian society simply had no framework for understanding a female pharaoh who wanted to lead troops into battle. Queens were supposed to stay in the palace, managing domestic affairs and providing heirs. Even the most powerful women in Egyptian history, like Hatshepsut, had ruled through surrogates and advisors rather than taking direct command of military operations. But Nefertiti wasn't asking for permission or trying to conform to traditional expectations. She was essentially betting her entire political future on her ability to succeed where Egypt's male rulers had recently failed. If she could restore Egyptian control over the disputed territories, if she could bring back tribute and prisoners and proof of victory, then no one would be able to question her legitimacy as pharaoh. The preparations for this campaign reveal just how thoroughly Nefertiti had thought through the political implications of her gamble. She didn't just gather troops and supplies, she carefully selected which commanders would accompany her and which would remain behind in Egypt. She made sure that her most trusted supporters were positioned to maintain control of key government functions while she was away, and she arranged for Tutankhamun to remain in Amarna under the supervision of advisors she had personally chosen. But the most revealing aspect of Nefertiti's military preparations was how she presented the campaign to the Egyptian people. Rather than framing it as a desperate attempt to shore up her failing regime, she portrayed it as the natural culmination of the religious revolution that she and Akhenaten had begun. The Aten, she proclaimed, was not just the god of Egypt, but the god of all nations. By extending Egyptian control over foreign territories, she was actually spreading the true faith to peoples who had been living in ignorance of the sun disk's universal authority. This wasn't just imperial conquest. It was a holy war fought on behalf of the one true deity. This religious framing of her military campaign was politically brilliant because it transformed Nefertiti's greatest weakness into a potential source of strength. Critics had always argued that the Aten worship was a foreign innovation that had no place in Egyptian religion. Now, Nefertiti was essentially arguing that Egypt's imperial mission was to bring this superior religious understanding to the rest of the world. The army that marched north from Egypt in what was probably year 19 of the Amarna period, was unlike any force that had ever taken the field under pharaonic command. At its head rode a woman wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, followed by carefully selected commanders who had sworn personal loyalty to her rather than to the traditional military hierarchy. The troops themselves were a mixture of Egyptian regulars and foreign mercenaries, bound together not by shared ethnicity or traditional loyalty to the pharaonic institution, but by their commitment to the revolutionary ideals that Nefertiti represented. These were men who had been marginalized under the old system, soldiers who saw in Nefertiti's rise to power proof that merit and loyalty could triumph over birth and tradition. But as this unprecedented army made its way toward the contested territories of Syria, events back in Egypt were moving in directions that would ultimately prove far more decisive than anything that happened on the battlefield. Nefertiti's own father, was having a series of very private conversations with some very important people. The old man had watched his daughter's increasingly desperate political maneuvers with growing alarm, and he had reached a conclusion that would have devastating consequences for the woman who had made his rise to power possible. Nefertiti had become too dangerous, not just to Egypt's traditional order, but to her own supporters. Her military campaign was either going to succeed spectacularly, making her politically untouchable, or fail catastrophically, bringing down everyone associated with her regime. Either outcome posed serious risks for a man like A, who had built his career on being indispensable to whoever happened to be in power. So I began reaching out to other power brokers who shared his concerns about Nefertiti's increasingly erratic behavior. He spoke carefully with representatives of the old priesthood, suggesting that perhaps the time had come for a more moderate approach to religious reform. He had quiet conversations with military commanders who had remained in Egypt, exploring their thoughts about the kingdom's future leadership needs. Most importantly, he began spending more time with the young Tutankhamun, gradually convincing the boy that his stepmother's ambitions were putting the entire royal family at risk. I painted a picture of a woman who had lost touch with political reality, who was gambling Egypt's future on increasingly desperate schemes to maintain her illegitimate hold on power. The old advisor was particularly skillful at exploiting Tutankhamun's adolescent insecurities. Here was a teenager who had grown up in the shadow of one of history's most powerful women, who had never been allowed to exercise real authority despite his royal bloodline. I whispered that Nefertiti saw the boy as nothing more than a useful figurehead, someone to be manipulated and controlled, rather than respected as a legitimate heir to the pharaonic tradition. These conversations were having exactly the effect that I intended. By the time reports began filtering back from Nefertiti's military campaign, Tutankhamun had been thoroughly convinced that his stepmother represented a threat to everything he should rightfully inherit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but what kind of civilization the kingdom would become. And then, just when the political situation seemed like it couldn't become any more complicated, something happened that changed everything. A messenger arrived in Amarna with news from the north that would either vindicate Nefertiti's desperate gamble or provide her enemies with the perfect excuse to move against her once and for all. The reports from Syria were mixed, which in the deadly game of palace politics was almost worse than outright failure. Nefertiti's forces had won some battles and lost others. They had managed to restore Egyptian control over several important cities, but they had also suffered significant casualties and failed to achieve the kind of overwhelming victory that would silence all criticism of her leadership. More troubling still were the reports about Nefertiti's behavior during the campaign. According to soldiers who had returned to Egypt, the female pharaoh had personally participated in several battles, fighting alongside her troops in a manner that scandalized even her supporters. There were stories about her interrogating prisoners, making strategic decisions without consulting her commanders, and conducting religious ceremonies that seemed to blend traditional Egyptian practices with completely new rituals. These reports created a perfect opportunity for Nefertiti's enemies to move against her. I, Horemheb, and their allies began circulating stories about a queen who had been driven mad by power, who was endangering Egypt's military by treating warfare like some kind of religious ritual. They painted her campaign not as a heroic attempt to restore Egyptian authority, but as the reckless adventure of a woman who had completely lost touch with reality. Tutankhamun, now fully convinced that his stepmother posed a threat to his rightful inheritance, agreed to put his name to a proclamation that would effectively end Nefertiti's reign. The document, carefully crafted by Ay and his allies, announced that the young king was taking personal control of Egypt's government to protect the kingdom from the dangerous innovations that had weakened it during the Amarna period. The proclamation was a masterpiece of political propaganda. It didn't directly attack Nefertiti or accuse her of any specific crimes. Instead, it presented Tutankhamun's power grab as a reluctant response to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The young king was simply doing his duty to Egypt and to the gods by restoring traditional order to a kingdom that had been led astray by well-intentioned but ultimately misguided reforms. But the most devastating aspect of the proclamation was how it reframed Nefertiti's entire career. Rather than acknowledging her as a legitimate pharaoh who had ruled Egypt in her own right, it described her as a regent who had served admirably during Tutankhamun's minority, but who had unfortunately overstepped her proper authority. She wasn't being overthrown. She was simply being asked to step aside now that the rightful king was old enough to rule. This careful language was designed to give Nefertiti a face-saving way to accept her political defeat. If she agreed to return to Egypt and resume the more traditional role of Queen Mother, she could maintain her dignity and probably her life. All she had to do was abandon her claims to pharaonic authority and accept that her unprecedented experiment in female rule had come to an end. The proclamation was dispatched to Syria with great ceremony, carried by messengers who had been carefully instructed to present it as an opportunity for reconciliation rather than an ultimatum. But everyone involved in its creation understood exactly what they were really offering Nefertiti. Surrender now, or face the consequences of continued resistance. What happened next would determine whether the woman who had called herself Pharaoh would accept political defeat gracefully or choose to fight to the bitter end. The answer would reveal not just Nefertiti's character, but the true nature of the revolution she had tried to lead. And that answer, when it came, would be so shocking that it would echo through Egyptian history for the next 3,000 years. The messenger who carried Tutankhamun's proclamation to Syria must have expected to find a defeated woman ready to accept the inevitable. After all, what could one isolated female pharaoh do against the combined forces of Egypt's traditional power structure? But when he finally located Nefertiti's camp near the ancient city of Damascus, he discovered something that would have sent chills down the spine of anyone who understood Egyptian politics. Nefertiti wasn't just still fighting, she was winning. The reports that had filtered back to Egypt had been deliberately distorted by her enemies to make her campaign seem like a desperate failure. In reality, Nefertiti had achieved something that no Egyptian ruler had managed in decades. She had not only restored Egyptian control over the disputed Syrian territories, she had pushed further north than any pharaoh since the great conqueror Thutmose III. More importantly, she had done it in a way that created genuine loyalty among the conquered populations. Instead of simply demanding tribute and submission, Nefertiti had established a new model of Egyptian rule that combined military strength with religious tolerance. Local gods were incorporated into Aten worship, local customs were respected, and local leaders were given real authority within the Egyptian administrative system. This wasn't just military conquest, it was political genius. Nefertiti had created a buffer zone of genuinely loyal subjects who would defend Egyptian interests not because they were forced to, but because Egyptian rule had actually improved their lives. For the first time in generations, Egypt's northern borders were truly secure. But the messenger carrying Tutankhamun's proclamation didn't see the strategic brilliance of what Nefertiti had accomplished. All he saw was a woman who had violated every traditional expectation of how Egyptian queens should behave. She wore armor instead of ceremonial robes. She consulted directly with foreign officials instead of working through Egyptian intermediaries. And most shocking of all, she had established her own court in Syria instead of maintaining proper deference to the royal center back in Egypt. When the messenger finally gained an audience with Nefertiti, he found himself face to face with someone who seemed to have been transformed by her military success. Gone was any trace of the desperate politician who had left Egypt months earlier. In her place stood a woman who radiated the kind of absolute confidence that comes from proving your enemies wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The messenger began reading Tutankhamun's proclamation, probably expecting Nefertiti to interrupt him with protests or pleas for negotiation. Instead, she listened in complete silence until he had finished every word. Then she asked a single question that revealed just how thoroughly she understood the political game being played against her. "Tell me," she said, "who wrote these words? Because they certainly didn't come from the mind of a child." The messenger, caught off guard by her directness, stammered something about the young king receiving guidance from his advisors. Nefertiti's response was a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "Guidance," she repeated. "Is that what they're calling treason these days?" What happened next became the stuff of legend among the soldiers who witnessed it. Instead of sending back a formal written response to Tutankhamun's proclamation, Nefertiti dictated a message that was so audacious it took the messenger's breath away. She wasn't returning to Egypt as a defeated queen seeking mercy. She was staying in Syria as pharaoh, ruling over territories that she had personally conquered in the name of the Aten. Anyone who wished to challenge her authority was welcome to come north and try to take these lands away from her by force. Until then, she would govern her new kingdom according to her own vision of what Egyptian civilization could become. The messenger must have thought he was listening to the ravings of a madwoman. No Egyptian ruler had ever voluntarily divided the kingdom. The very concept of competing pharaohs was so alien to Egyptian political thought that there wasn't even proper vocabulary to describe what Nefertiti was proposing. But Nefertiti wasn't finished. She had one more message for the people back in Egypt who thought they could manipulate her stepson into betraying her. She was pregnant. Let that sink in for a moment. Here's a woman who had just established herself as an independent ruler over Egyptian Syria and territories, and now she's announcing that she's carrying what could be the next pharaoh. If the child was a boy, he would have a legitimate claim to rule all of Egypt based on his mother's proven ability to defend Egyptian interests and expand Egyptian territory. The political implications of this announcement were staggering. Tutankhamun was still just a teenager with no military experience and no proven ability to govern. Nefertiti was a mature ruler who had just demonstrated her capability by achieving military victories that had eluded Egypt's leaders for decades. Any child she bore would represent a continuation of her successful policies, while Tutankhamun represented nothing more than a return to the failed approaches of the past. The messenger rode back to Egypt carrying news that would throw the entire kingdom into chaos. The woman they had tried to politically outmaneuver had instead outmaneuvered them, transforming what should have been her moment of greatest weakness into a position of unprecedented strength. When word of Nefertiti's response reached Amarna, the reaction was immediate and explosive. I, who had orchestrated the entire plot to remove his daughter from power, found himself facing a situation he had never anticipated. Instead of eliminating Nefertiti as a political threat, he had inadvertently created something far more dangerous, a rival pharaoh with her own territory, her own army, and her own vision for Egypt's future. Horemheb's reaction was even more intense. The general had spent months arguing that Egypt needed strong military leadership to restore its position in the ancient world. Now he was confronted with the humiliating reality that a woman had achieved military successes that had eluded him and his fellow commanders for years. But it was Tutankhamun's response that revealed just how thoroughly Nefertiti had outplayed her enemies. The teenage pharaoh, who had been so confident when he signed the proclamation demanding his stepmother's submission, now found himself in an impossible position. If he accepted Nefertiti's independence, he would be acknowledging that Egypt could be legitimately divided. If he tried between competing rulers to force her to return, he would be starting a civil war against someone who had just proven her military capabilities. The young king's advisors urged him to take immediate military action. Egypt couldn't tolerate the existence of a rival pharaoh, they argued, especially not one who might produce an heir with a stronger claim to legitimacy than Tutankhamun himself possessed. Every day that Nefertiti remained independent in Syria was another day that undermined the entire basis of pharaonic authority. But Tutankhamun hesitated, and that hesitation revealed something crucial about the political situation. Despite all the propaganda about restoring traditional Egyptian values, despite all the criticism of Nefertiti's unconventional methods, the simple truth was that she had succeeded where traditional approaches had failed. Her Syrian territories were more secure, more prosperous, and more loyal to Egyptian rule than they had been in generations. This success created a terrible dilemma for Egypt's traditional power structure. They had removed Nefertiti from power because they claimed her methods were weakening the kingdom. Now, they were confronted with evidence that her methods actually worked better than theirs. How could they justify starting a civil war to stop someone who was making Egypt stronger? The answer came from an unexpected source: the priests of Amun-Ra, who had been displaced during Akhenaten's religious revolution. These men had been waiting decades for an opportunity to restore their influence, and they saw in the crisis with Nefertiti the perfect chance to reassert their traditional role as the power behind the throne. The priests approached Tutankhamun with a proposal that was breathtakingly cynical in its calculation. They would support his claim to exclusive pharaonic authority. They would provide the religious legitimacy he needed to justify military action against Nefertiti. And they would help him present any conflict as a holy war to restore proper worship of the traditional gods. In exchange, Tutankhamun would have to completely abandon the religious innovations of the Amarna period. The Aten would be demoted from supreme deity back to just another minor aspect of the sun god Ra. The temples that Akhenaten and Nefertiti had built would be destroyed or converted to traditional use. Most importantly, all records of the Amarna period would be systematically erased from Egyptian history. This proposal offered Tutankhamun something he desperately needed: a way to frame his conflict with Nefertiti as something more noble than a family power struggle. Instead of admitting that he was fighting his stepmother for control of the throne, he could present himself as Egypt's savior, the righteous pharaoh who was restoring proper order after decades of religious chaos. The teenage king's acceptance of this proposal marked the beginning of one of the most systematic cover-ups in ancient history. Within months of reaching his agreement with the Amun-Ra priesthood, work crews began chiseling Nefertiti's name and image off monuments throughout Egypt. Official documents were rewritten to minimize or eliminate references to her reign. Even private inscriptions that mentioned her were sought out and destroyed. But erasing Nefertiti from Egyptian records was only the first step in Tutankhamun's campaign against her. The real test would come when he tried to force her to abandon her Syrian kingdom and submit to his authority. And that test would reveal whether the woman who had called herself Pharaoh was prepared to fight to the death to defend her unprecedented experiment in female rule. The army that marched north from Egypt in what was probably year 20 of the Amarna period was the largest force that had taken the field during Tutankhamun's reign. At its head rode the young pharaoh himself, wearing armor that had been blessed by the restored priests of Amun-Ra. and carrying weapons that bore inscriptions declaring his divine mandate to reunite the two lands under proper religious authority. But this wasn't just a military expedition. It was a propaganda campaign designed to demonstrate that traditional Egyptian values were stronger than Nefertiti's revolutionary innovations. The army included representatives of all the old power centers that had been marginalized during the Amarna period. Priests from the great temples, nobles from the ancient families, commanders who traced their authority back to the warrior pharaohs of Egypt's imperial golden age. The message was clear. Egypt's traditional order was reasserting itself, and anyone who had supported Nefertiti's experiment would be wise to change sides before it was too late. As Tutankhamun's army approached the Syrian territories that Nefertiti controlled, messengers rode ahead offering amnesty to any Egyptian officials who abandoned her would be preserved if they switched their cause. Local commanders were promised that their ranks and privileges loyalty to the legitimate pharaoh. Even foreign allies were assured that their treaties with Egypt would be honored if they refused to support the rebel queen. These offers were politically shrewd because they exploited the one weakness in Nefertiti's position. Her power in Syria depended on personal loyalty from people who had chosen to follow her rather than institutional authority that commanded automatic obedience. If enough of her supporters could be convinced to abandon her cause, her entire kingdom would collapse without a single battle. But Nefertiti had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of political warfare. She had used her time in Syria not just to consolidate military control over the territory, but to create genuine bonds of loyalty with the people she ruled. Local officials owed their positions to her personal favor. Foreign allies had prospered under her protection, and her own soldiers had shared in the wealth that came from successful military campaigns. More importantly, she had given all of these people something that traditional Egyptian rule had never offered them, a sense that they were participating in something historically significant. They weren't just serving another pharaoh, they were helping to create a new model of Egyptian civilization that valued merit over birth, innovation over tradition, and genuine religious devotion over empty ritual. When Tutankhamun's messengers began circulating through Syrian cities with their offers of amnesty, they discovered something that shocked them. Instead of eagerly abandoning Nefertiti's cause, most of her supporters reacted with contempt for the young pharaoh's attempts to buy their loyalty. These weren't people who were looking for an excuse to change sides. They were true believers in Nefertiti's vision of what Egypt could become, and they were prepared to fight to defend that vision against anyone who threatened it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but what kind of civilization the kingdom would represent. On one side stood Tutankhamun and the forces of traditional order, backed by the wealth and institutional authority of Egypt's ancient establishments. On the other side stood Nefertiti and her followers, outnumbered and isolated, but united by their commitment to revolutionary change. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most decisive moments in Egyptian history, the point where the kingdom's future was determined by the clash between old and new ways of organizing society. But before that battle could begin, one final player would enter the game. Someone whose intervention would change everything anyone thought they knew about Nefertiti's ultimate fate. That player was death itself, arriving in a form that no one had anticipated and targeting the one person whose survival was essential to everything that was about to unfold. Because sometimes in history, the most carefully laid plans are destroyed not by human enemies, but by forces that no amount of political skill or military strength can overcome. And when death finally came, forthcoming in Nefertiti, it were a way that ensured her disappearance from history would be as mysterious as her rise to power had been unprecedented. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand how Nefertiti vanished from the historical record, we need to witness the final confrontation between her vision of Egyptian civilization and the traditional forces that were determined to destroy everything she had built. That confrontation was about to begin, and its outcome would echo through the corridors of Egyptian history for the next 3,000 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Syrian hills as two armies faced each other across a narrow valley that would soon be soaked with blood. On the southern ridge, Tutankhamun's forces stretched in perfect formation, their bronze spear points glinting in the dawn light like a field of deadly stars. The young pharaoh sat astride his war chariot, surrounded by the greatest military commanders Egypt had produced in a generation. But it was the army on the northern ridge that truly captured the imagination of anyone who witnessed that fateful morning. Nefertiti's forces were smaller, yes, but they possessed something that Egyptian armies hadn't displayed in decades: the fierce unity of people fighting for an idea rather than just following orders. At their center rode the queen herself, and the sight of her would have taken your breath away. She wore armor that gleamed like liquid gold in the morning light, but it wasn't ceremonial decoration designed to impress courtiers. This was real battle gear, scarred from previous fights, practical and deadly. Her famous beauty hadn't diminished, but it had been transformed by months of campaign life into something harder, more dangerous. Most striking of all was her condition. Even from a distance, even through the haze of morning mist, observers could see the unmistakable signs of her pregnancy. Here was a woman carrying the future of Egypt in her womb, preparing to risk everything in single combat to determine who would rule the ancient world's greatest empire. The two armies remained motionless for what felt like hours, neither side willing to make the first move that would unleash forces none of them could control. Messengers rode back and forth between the lines, carrying final offers of negotiation, last chances for compromise, desperate attempts to avoid a civil war that could tear Egypt apart forever. But both Tutankhamun and Nefertiti understood that this moment had been inevitable from the day she first claimed pharaonic authority. There could be only one legitimate ruler of Egypt, and that question would be settled not by political maneuvering or religious arguments, but by the ancient test of armed combat. The battle cry that finally shattered the morning silence came not from either pharaoh, but from somewhere deep within Nefertiti's ranks. One of her Syrian allies, a grizzled veteran who had fought alongside her through months of desert warfare, suddenly raised his spear and shouted something in his native language that needed no translation. The words rippled through both armies like wildfire. Within seconds, thousands of voices had taken up the chant, and then the entire northern ridge exploded into motion as Nefertiti's forces charged down the hillside with a ferocity that caught their enemies completely off guard. What followed was unlike any battle in Egyptian military history. Traditional Egyptian warfare was a highly ritualized affair, with specific formations, predetermined tactics, and careful attention to preserving the pharaoh's safety above all else. But Nefertiti had learned warfare in the brutal school of Syrian desert fighting, where survival depended on speed, improvisation, and the willingness to take risks that would horrify conventional commanders. She led the charge herself, her golden chariot cutting through enemy lines like a blade through silk. Behind her came a mixed force of Egyptian regulars, Syrian cavalry, and Nubian archers who had remained loyal to her cause. They fought with the desperate courage of people who knew that defeat meant not just military loss, but the complete destruction of everything they had worked to build. Tutankhamun's forces, despite their superior numbers and equipment, found themselves thrown into chaos by sheer audacity of Nefertiti's assault. They had expected a defensive battle, a siege that would slowly starve their enemies into submission. Instead, they were facing a direct attack led by a pregnant woman who seemed utterly fearless in the face of death. The young pharaoh himself fought bravely, but his inexperience showed in every decision he made. Where Nefertiti adapted instantly to changing battlefield conditions, Tutankhamun hesitated, waiting for his advisors to tell him what traditional tactics required. Where she inspired her troops through personal example, he remained safely behind his bodyguards, issuing orders that arrived too late to affect the rapidly shifting course of battle. For a few crucial hours, It seemed as though Nefertiti might actually achieve the impossible. Her smaller force was driving Tutankhamun's army back across the valley floor, capturing standards, taking prisoners, and creating the kind of momentum that could turn a desperate gamble into a legendary victory. But then disaster struck from the one direction that no amount of military genius could have anticipated. In the midst of the fiercest fighting, as Nefertiti was personally leading an assault on Tutankhamun's command position, she suddenly doubled over in her chariot, clutching her abdomen. The pregnancy that had been her greatest political weapon had become her most dangerous vulnerability. The stress of battle, the physical demands of combat, the sheer emotional intensity of fighting for her life and her legacy had triggered complications that no ancient physician could treat. Her charioteer, a grizzled veteran who had served her faithfully through every campaign, immediately began pulling back from the front lines. But the done. War damage was already spread through her army with terrifying speed. Possibly dying, and the cause the Queen was wounds they were fighting for hung in the balance. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't professional soldiers who would continue fighting regardless of their commander's fate. These were personal followers who had joined Nefertiti's cause because they believed in her as an individual. Without her visible presence on the battlefield, without her voice shouting encouragement, without her golden armor flashing in the sun began to lose light. The unity that had made them so the fierce, Tutankhamun's effective. Commanders, experienced enough to recognize a turning point when they saw one, immediately launched a counterattack that caught Nefertiti's wavering forces at their moment of maximum vulnerability. What had begun as her triumph quickly transformed into a rout as her supporters found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and leaderless. But even as her army collapsed around her, even as her enemies closed in for what should have been the final blow, Nefertiti managed to pull off one last masterstroke that would ensure her leg and IFD survived, even she didn't. Rather than allowing herself to be captured, than giving Tutankhamun the satisfaction of parading her through Egyptian cities as a defeated rebel, she ordered her most trusted followers to spirit her away from the battlefield. A small group of her most loyal supporters formed a protective circle around her chariot and fought their way clear of the main battle, disappearing into the desert hills that she knew better than any of her pursuers. What happened next became the subject of rumors and speculation that would persist for thousands saw Nefertiti's group of years. Some witnesses claimed of heading east toward the territories Egypt's enemies, where she might find refuge among rulers who they had seen that'd be happy to shelter a rival pharaoh. Others insist south. Back fugitives moving Nefertiti might still toward Egypt itself, where have supporters willing to hide her from Tutankhamun's vengeance. But the most persistent stories, the ones that would eventually become the foundation, Egypt's van for countless legends about her followers, had headed westish in Queen, claimed that Nefertiti and into the deepest part of the Syrian desert, toward territories that no had ever successfully Egyptian army. According penetrated, pregnant Queen had chosen to these accounts, the exile over Surrenderia into the waste, preferring to disappearance rather than submit to the traditional forces that had defeat experiment. She would her revolutionary child in some hidden, give birth to her oasis, raise him or her to understand their true heritage, and perhaps someday return to claim ears. The throne that was Tutankhamun's victory, rightfully, the celebration that night was muted by the knowledge that his greatest enemy had escape advisors urged. His pursuit forced him to send into the desert to hunt down Nefertiti before a new base she could establish of operations or from foreign powers. But the Sikh helpitated, perhaps young Pharaoh he's recognizing that chasing shadows through hostile do more harm than good to established authority territory might his newly. Instead, he chose approach that a different would prove the long run. Rather far more effective in than acknowledging Nefertiti's escape, rather than admitting that she had eluded his grasp, Tutankhamun simply announced that the Queen had been rebel defeated and was no longer a threat to Egyptian security. Official records of the battle made no mention of her disappearance. Court historians wrote suggest accounts that she had died in the fighting, struck down right by fierce wrath of the traditional gods she had defied. Even private accounts letters and personal carefully edited to remove any suggestion was Egypt that dangerous most enemy might still be alive somewhere beyond the kingdom's borders. This systematic cover-up was so successful that within a Egyptians' believed generation, most that Nefertiti had indeed perished in the Syrian who had once ruled battle. The woman Egypt as pharaoh became nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing women to interfere in foreigners and matters that should be left to legitimate male rulers of proven Egyptian bloodline. But the truth was far more complex and far more dangerous to Tutankhamun's regime than his propaganda suggested. Scattered throughout Egypt were people who knew that Nefertiti had escaped, people who remembered her achievements, people who might still be loyal to her cause if she ever returned to claim her throne. These hidden supporters posed a constant threat to Tutankhamun's authority, a network of potential rebels who could be activated if the vanished queen ever decided to resume her challenge to traditional Egyptian rule. The young pharaoh's advisors understood this danger perfectly, which is why they invested so much effort in erasing every trace of Nefertiti's reign from official memory. But erasing someone from official records is very different from erasing them from reality as. And the months passed after battle, distir the Syrian Bing reports back to begin filtering Egypt about strange events in the desert territories where Nefertiti has spoke of seeing lights in parts D disappeared. Bedouin traders know human settlements should exist of the wasteland where. Ka, with well-army Arvan leaders, reported encounters groups who seemed to be protecting something or someone in the deep deserts. Most intriguingly, several witnesses claimed to have met travelers who spoke perfect Egyptian, but explained their business themselves or refused to identify in such remote territories. These reports created exactly the kind of uncertainty that Tutankhamun's regime couldn't afford. As long as there was any possibility that Nefertiti, long as her ultimate might still be alive, as fate remained unknown, her legend would continue to inspire engers to traditional potential Chol Egyptian authority. The solution that I Annalie ruthless, Ifised was both brilliant and ut Horemheb dev they or kill Nefertiti. If they couldn't definite capture could naively prove that she was no longer a threat, then they would simply levant by make her era revolutionary ideas cause society so transforming Egyptian completely that her'd never again find fertile ground. This transformation began with Tutankhamun himself. The teenage pharaoh who had defeated Nefertiti in battle was systematically molded into the perfect symbol of traditional Egyptian values. His marriage to one-of continuity with the old royal Akhenaten's daughters provide line while repudiating everything the Amarna period had represented. His role as the faithful. His public appearances emphasize servant of the ancient gods, the humble instrument through which traditional religious authority was restored to its proper place in Egyptian society. More importantly, Tutankhamun's advisors began implementing policies designed to make Nefertiti's style of rule impossible for any future challenger to adopt. The military was reorganized to prevent any individual commander from accumulating the kind of personal made Nefertiti so dangerous loyalty that Haenden. The priesthood was strength powers given new to review and approve any changes to traditional religious practices. Even the royal succession laws were modified to make Ionic authority under it. Virtually changes were presents impossible for women to claim, fair prevent future, inst any circumstances. These ability, practical to the Egyptian people, as necessary reforms to measures designed to ensure that the kind of civil conflict that had nearly system that was kingdom would never again be torn apart by the immune to the kin. But their real purpose was to create a political, destroyed it during the Amarna period of revolutionary challenge. That Donny was that by working Nefertiti had mounted. The ear advisors were actually acknowledge an effectiveness of her methods, Tutankhamun's digging the power Nefertiti, from a rising ruling Egyptiting that her approach to so hard to prevent another. They were essentially ADM successful. That extraordinary had been so, measures were required to prevent anyone else from following her example. But even as Egypt's traditional power structure congratulated itself on having solved the Nefertiti problem, events were unfolding in the desert that would soon test their confidence in ways they had never anticipated. The woman they thought they had defeated was Notash. One final was preparing to unleash only still alive. She surprised that would shake the ancient world to its foundations. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. Deep in the Syrian wasteland, in an oasis whose location was known only to a handful of her most trusted followers, Nefertiti had given birth to a son. The child bore the physical features of his mother's legendary beauty combined with something else, something that made even hardened desert warriors speak of him in hushed, reverent tones. This boy, whose very existence was unknown to the Egyptian authorities, who thought they had eliminated his mother's threat forever, was being raised with the throne that was a single purpose: to wreck his birthright and to complete the revolutionary transformation of Egyptian society that Nefertiti had begun. His education was unlike anything any royal child had ever received. Instead of learning the traditional arts of Egyptian kingship from palace tutors, he was taught statecraft by his mother's Syrian allies, military tactics by her veteran commanders, and religious philosophy by priests who had remained loyal to the Aten, even after its worship had been banned throughout Egypt. Most importantly, he was taught the true story of his mother's reign, the real history of the Amarna period that Tutankhamun's historians were working so desperately to erase from Egyptian memory. He learned about Nefertiti's achievements, her struggles, her vision of what Egypt could become if traditional limitations were cast aside in favor of merit-based leadership. This hidden prince grew up understanding that he was the living embodiment of everything the current Egyptian regime feared most. Proof that Nefertiti's revolutionary ideals had survived. Proof that her bloodline continued. Proof that the traditional order's victory had been incomplete. And as he approached adolescence, as he began to demonstrate the same combination of intelligence, charisma, and ruthless determination that had made his mother so dangerous, his supporters began to whisper about the possibility of return. The network of Nefertiti's hidden followers throughout Egypt had never been completely dismantled. Many had gone underground, adopting the appearance of loyal subjects while secretly maintaining their commitment to the vanished queen's cause. Others had fled to remote provinces where Tutankhamun's authority was weak and traditional Egyptian values had never taken deep root. These scattered supporters began receiving messages through carefully concealed channels, cryptic communications that spoke of new hope, of ancient promises that would soon be fulfilled, of a dawn that would break over Egypt with the force of divine revelation. The messages were signed with a name that sent chills through anyone who understood its implications. Ankhesenamun Tasherit, which meant living image of the Aten's daughter. This was clearly a royal name, clearly connected to the Amarna period, and clearly belonging to someone who claimed legitimate authority over Egypt's future. But who was this mysterious figure? Was it Nefertiti herself, operating under a new identity? Was it her son, now old enough to begin his own campaign for the throne? Or was it someone else entirely? Perhaps another survivor of the Amarna royal family who had remained hidden until the time was right to reveal themselves. The answer to these questions would determine whether Egypt's traditional order would continue to dominate the kingdom unchallenged, or whether the ancient land was about to experience another revolutionary upheaval that would dwarf even the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. As reports of these mysterious messages reached Tutankhamun's court, the young pharaoh found himself facing exactly the kind of crisis his advisors had worked so hard to prevent. The ghost of Nefertiti was rising from the desert, and with it came the possibility that everything they had fought to achieve might be swept away by forces they thought they had defeated forever. The stage was set for a final confrontation between old and new, between tradition and revolution, between the Egypt that was and the Egypt that might yet be. And at the center of this approaching storm stood the legacy of a woman whose name meant, "The beautiful one has come." A woman whose disappearance from history was about to prove far more temporary than her enemies had dared to hope. The response came swifter than anyone could have anticipated. Within weeks of the first mysterious messages appearing throughout Egypt, a phenomenon began spreading that would have been impossible to contain using traditional methods of political control. It started in the markets of Memphis, where traders began whispering about strange dreams they claimed to have shared. Visions of a golden queen rising from the desert sands with the sun itself blazing behind her. But these weren't just random stories told by superstitious merchants. The details were too specific, too consistent across different regions where people had no contact with each other. They spoke of seeing the same face, hearing the same voice, witnessing the same symbols that had been associated with Nefertiti during her reign. More disturbing still, many of these dreamers claimed to have received specific instructions about where to go and what to do when the time of revelation arrived. Tutankhamun's spies, who had been monitoring these developments with growing alarm, reported something that sent shockwaves through the royal court. The dreams weren't random occurrences affecting isolated individuals. They seemed to be following a pattern, appearing first among former servants of the Amarna royal household, then spreading to their families and associates, and finally reaching people who had never had any direct connection to Nefertiti's regime. This wasn't supernatural intervention. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. Someone with intimate knowledge of Egyptian society was using carefully planted agents to spread a message that would resonate with people's deepest fears and hopes about their kingdom's future. The very fact that these messages were coming through dreams rather than direct communication made them almost impossible to counter using conventional propaganda. How do you argue with a vision? How do you discredit a message that people believe they received directly from the gods themselves? Tutankhamun's advisors found themselves facing a challenge that their political experience had never prepared them to handle. The situation became even more complicated when reports began arriving from Egypt's borders. Caravans traveling the trade routes that connected Egypt to the wider ancient world were encountering something unprecedented. Well-armed groups who claimed to be acting on behalf of the rightful pharaoh of Egypt. These mysterious forces weren't attacking Egyptian merchants or interfering with normal commerce. Instead, they were providing protection against bandits, mediating disputes between traders, and generally behaving like representatives of a legitimate government. But when questioned about their authority, these groups would only say that they served the living embodiment of Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept of divine truth and justice. They carried banners that bore symbols from the Amarna period, mixed with traditional Egyptian religious imagery, suggesting a synthesis of old and new that was far more sophisticated than anything Akhenaten had attempted. Most intriguingly, these groups seemed to have access to intelligence about Egyptian government activities that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. They knew which caravans would be traveling specific routes weeks before those journeys were officially announced. They understood the political relationships between different Egyptian officials well enough to predict policy changes before they were implemented. Someone was providing them with information from deep within Tutankhamun's own administration. The realization that his government had been infiltrated by Nefertiti's supporters sent the young pharaoh into a panic that his advisors struggled to contain. If the vanished queen really was still alive, if she really had spent years building a network of agents throughout Egypt, then the kingdom was facing a threat that was far more dangerous than a simple military rebellion. This wasn't just about competing claims to the throne. This was about the complete subversion of Egyptian society from within, the gradual replacement of traditional loyalty structures with something entirely new and potentially unstoppable. Every courtier became suspect, every official potentially compromised, every policy decision possibly influenced by enemies who remained hidden in plain sight. The old advisor who had orchestrated Nefertiti's original downfall, found himself in the impossible position of having to hunt for traces of his own daughter's influence throughout the government he had helped to create. The irony wasn't lost on him that his success in placing loyal supporters in key positions throughout the Egyptian bureaucracy had created exactly the kind of network that Nefertiti could now exploit for her own purposes. But the most disturbing development came when Tutankhamun's investigators began examining the backgrounds of people who claimed to have received the mysterious dreams. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they understood about the scope of Nefertiti's influence during her years in power. Many of the dreamers turned out to be people who had received personal favors from Nefertiti during her reign as queen and pharaoh. A farmer whose fields had been protected from flooding by one of her irrigation projects. A craftsman whose workshop had been given a lucrative government contract during the Amarna period. A soldier whose life had been saved by medical treatment provided by physicians she had personally trained. These weren't political supporters in the traditional sense. They weren't people who had chosen sides in an ideological conflict. They were ordinary Egyptians whose lives had been concretely improved by Nefertiti's policies, people who remembered her not as a religious revolutionary or a political threat, but as a ruler who had actually cared about their welfare. This realization forced Tutankhamun and his advisors to confront an uncomfortable truth about their own reign. Despite all their efforts to restore traditional Egyptian values, despite all their propaganda about the dangers of the Amarna period, they had never actually replaced the practical benefits that Nefertiti's government had provided to ordinary people. The irrigation systems she had built were still functioning, but they hadn't been maintained or expanded. The medical schools she had established were still training physicians, but they had been stripped of the resources needed to serve Egypt's poorest communities. The trade agreements she had negotiated were still generating wealth for the kingdom, but that wealth was increasingly concentrated among the traditional elites who had supported Tutankhamun's rise to power. In their determination to erase Nefertiti's legacy, they had inadvertently created exactly the kind of popular discontent that could fuel a successful rebellion against their rule. People weren't supporting her potential return because they shared her religious beliefs or her political theories. They were supporting her because they remembered when their lives had been better under her leadership. This understanding led to a dramatic shift in the government's response to the growing crisis. Instead of simply trying to suppress news of the mysterious messages and dreams, Tutankhamun's advisors began implementing policies designed to address the legitimate grievances that were making ordinary Egyptians receptive to calls for change. New irrigation projects were announced, medical facilities were expanded, and trade policies were modified to ensure that more of Egypt's wealth reached the common people rather than being concentrated among the traditional nobility. These weren't just desperate attempts to buy loyalty, they were genuine efforts to provide the kind of effective governance that had made Nefertiti so popular during her own reign. But even as Tutankhamun's government worked to address domestic concerns, events beyond Egypt's borders were developing in ways that would soon make internal policies irrelevant. The mysterious forces that had been providing protection for trade caravans began coordinating their activities in ways that suggested a central command structure of remarkable sophistication. Instead of operating as isolated groups responding to local conditions, they started functioning as components of a larger strategy designed to gradually isolate Egypt from the wider ancient world. Trade routes were subtly redirected to bypass traditional Egyptian markets. Diplomatic communications were intercepted and delayed. Military intelligence about Egypt's defenses was systematically gathered and presumably passed on to potential enemies. Most ominously, these coordinated activities seemed to be building towards some kind of climactic event that would test Egypt's ability to defend itself against threats that combined military, economic, and psychological warfare in ways that traditional Egyptian strategy had never encountered. The first concrete indication of what this event might involve came from an unexpected source. A Hittite ambassador who arrived in Memphis carrying a message that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The Hittite king, Egypt's greatest rival for control of the ancient Middle East, was formally requesting a meeting with the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt to discuss matters of mutual interest. But the ambassador wasn't asking to meet with Tutankhamun. He was asking to meet with someone he referred to as she who brings truth to the two lands, using titles and epithets that had been associated with Nefertiti during her reign as pharaoh. The implication was clear. Egypt's enemies no longer recognized Tutankhamun as the kingdom's rightful ruler. This diplomatic bombshell revealed the true scope of the crisis facing Egypt's traditional government. The mysterious network that had been operating along Egypt's borders wasn't just a collection of bandits or rebels. It was apparently sophisticated enough to conduct international diplomacy, to negotiate with foreign powers, and to present itself as a legitimate alternative to Tutankhamun's regime. The young pharaoh's response to this challenge would determine whether Egypt remained united under traditional rule or fractured into competing centers of authority that could tear the ancient kingdom apart. His advisors urged immediate military action, a massive campaign to hunt down and destroy the mysterious forces before they could consolidate their position further. But Tutankhamun hesitated, and that hesitation revealed something crucial about the political situation that had developed. Despite all the propaganda about his victory over Nefertiti, despite all the efforts to present him as Egypt's savior, the young pharaoh understood that his authority rested on far shakier foundations than his public image suggested. A military campaign against enemies who had already demonstrated their ability to operate within Egyptian territory would be incredibly risky. If it failed, if the mysterious forces proved capable of inflicting significant casualties on Egypt's regular army, then Tutankhamun's reputation for strength and competence would be shattered. Other potential challenges might emerge, emboldened by evidence that the traditional order could be successfully opposed. Even if the campaign succeeded, even if the immediate threat was eliminated, the underlying conditions that had made ordinary Egyptians receptive to calls for change would remain unaddressed. Victory might buy time, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problems that were making Tutankhamun's rule increasingly unpopular among the people he claimed to represent. The dilemma facing Egypt's traditional government was complicated further by intelligence reports suggesting that the mysterious network wasn't planning to challenge Tutankhamun's authority directly. Instead, they seemed to be preparing for something far more subtle and potentially more devastating. A gradual demonstration that alternative leadership could provide more effective governance than the traditional system. Evidence for this strategy came from the borderlands where the mysterious forces had been most active. Communities that had come under their protection were reporting improvements in security, commerce, and general welfare that contrasted sharply with conditions in areas still under direct Egyptian government control. These weren't conquered territories being exploited by occupying forces. They were populations that seemed to be genuinely prospering under new management. Word of these improvements was spreading throughout Egypt through the same informal networks that had carried news of the mysterious dreams and messages. People were beginning to compare their own situations with what they heard about conditions in the territories where alternative authority was being exercised. The comparisons weren't favorable to Tutankhamun's government. This created exactly the kind of popular pressure that traditional Egyptian political structures were poorly equipped to handle. The pharaonic system depended on the assumption that royal authority was divinely ordained and therefore automatically legitimate regardless of its practical effectiveness. But if ordinary people began to believe that non-royal leadership could actually provide better governance, then the entire ideological foundation of traditional Egyptian society would be undermined. Tutankhamun's advisors found themselves caught between contradictory imperatives that threatened to paralyze their response to the growing crisis. They needed to demonstrate strength against the external threat, but they also needed to avoid actions that might provoke the internal rebellion they feared was brewing throughout Egypt. They needed to maintain traditional religious and political forms, but they also needed to provide the kind of effective governance that would keep ordinary Egyptians loyal to their regime. The solution they eventually adopted was characteristically Egyptian in its complexity and sophistication. Instead of confronting the mysterious network directly, they would attempt to co-opt its methods while discrediting its legitimacy. Tutankhamun would launch his own campaign to improve conditions for ordinary Egyptians, but he would present these improvements as the natural result of restoring proper religious observance and traditional political order. This approach had the advantage of addressing popular grievances while maintaining the ideological foundations of pharaonic authority. If successful, it could neutralize the appeal of alternative leadership without requiring the risky military confrontation that might expose weaknesses in Tutankhamun's position. But the success of this strategy depended on something that was far from guaranteed: the ability of Egypt's traditional political system to actually deliver the kind of practical improvements that would make ordinary people prefer royal governance to whatever alternatives were being offered by the mysterious network. The test of that ability was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just Tutankhamun's fate as pharaoh, but the future of Egyptian civilization itself. Because somewhere in the desert wasteland where she had vanished years earlier, Nefertiti was preparing to reveal the final phase of a plan that had been decades in the making. The woman who had once ruled Egypt as pharaoh was about to demonstrate that disappearing from history was very different from disappearing from reality. And when she finally emerged from the shadows where she had been building her strength, the ancient world would discover that reports of her defeat had been greatly exaggerated. The network of supporters she had cultivated, the alliances she had forged, the alternative vision of Egyptian governance she had developed during her years in exile, were all components of a strategy designed to accomplish something that no ruler in ancient history had ever attempted: the peaceful transformation of an entire civilization through the gradual demonstration of superior leadership. But peaceful transformation required the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of the existing power structure. And as Tutankhamun's advisors implemented their counter-strategy, as they began their own campaign to win popular support through improved governance, it became increasingly clear that cooperation was the one thing Nefertiti could never expect to receive. The stage was set for a final confrontation between two competing visions of what Egypt could become. On one side stood the traditional order, backed by centuries of precedent and the institutional authority of the pharaonic system. On the other side stood the revolutionary alternative that Nefertiti had spent years developing in the crucible of desert exile. The outcome of this confrontation would be determined not by military might or political maneuvering, but by the most fundamental test of leadership. Which side could actually provide the kind of governance that ordinary Egyptians needed to survive and prosper in an increasingly dangerous world? And as the ancient kingdom held its breath, waiting to see which vision would prevail, one thing became absolutely clear: the beautiful queen who had once vanished into the desert was about to return to claim her place in history. Whether that place would be as Egypt's greatest ruler or its most tragic failure remained to be seen. But either way, Nefertiti's story was far from over. The woman whose disappearance had baffled archaeologists for 3,000 years was preparing to reveal that sometimes the most effective way to change the world is to let your enemies think they've already won. The moment Tutankhamun's spies brought word that the mysterious network was mobilizing along Egypt's eastern borders, something shifted in the young pharaoh's demeanor that his advisors had never seen before. Gone was the hesitant teenager who had struggled with every major decision since claiming the throne. In his place stood a ruler who seemed to finally understand that his kingdom's survival depended on actions, not deliberation. But the intelligence reports painted a picture that would have challenged even the most experienced military commander. The forces gathering in the Syrian desert weren't behaving like a typical rebel army preparing for invasion. They weren't massing troops for a direct assault on Egyptian territory, weren't establishing siege equipment, weren't following any of the conventional patterns that Egyptian military doctrine had been designed to counter. Instead, they were doing something far more sophisticated and potentially more dangerous. They were building cities. The first settlement appeared seemingly overnight in an oasis that Egyptian maps had always marked as uninhabitable wasteland. Within weeks, trade routes that had bypassed the region for centuries were being redirected through this new community, where merchants found not only fresh water and supplies, but also the kind of efficient administration that made commerce genuinely profitable rather than merely possible. The second settlement emerged along a river valley that Egyptian engineers had declared impossible to irrigate. Yet somehow, these mysterious colonists had not only made the They Desert bloom. Agricultural had created surpluses that were being traded throughout the region. Local Duan tribes that barely submitting to the governance had never acknowledged was Egyptian authority were volunt of whoever organizing these remarkable transformations. By the time Egyptian scouts to infiltrate the area and send back detailed reports, a theorunded settlement was becoming impossible and the pattern to ignore. Someone with extraordinary resources and unprecedented expertise was systematically creating an alternative to Egyptian civilization right on the kingdom's doorstep. The reports from these settlements read like fantasies to officials in Memphis who had never seen anything comparable in Egypt itself. Cities where disputes were resolved through councils that included representatives from every social class. Agricultural systems that produce acre than fed more food per best Egyptian farms. Trade networks that operated with a level of honesty and efficiency that made Egyptian merchants weep with envy. Most disturbing of all, these settlements were attracting voluntary immigrants from throughout the ancient world. People were abandoning their homes in established kingdoms to join communities that offered something no traditional government had ever provided. Genuine social mobility based on merit rather than birth. Tutankhamun's advisors struggled to understand how such rapid development was even possible. Building a single city required resources, expertise, and organizational capabilities that normally took generations to accumulate. Creating multiple settlements simultaneously suggested access to wealth and knowledge that surpassed even Egypt's legendary capabilities. The answer, when it finally became clear, sent shockwaves through the royal court that would reverberate for months. The mysterious settlers weren't just building new, had been developed communities. They were implementing a comprehensive plan that over years of careful preparation. Every detail, from employed, reflect the location of each settlement to the specific technologies being of strategic thinking the kin that Kuths and Egyptian only come from someone with intimate knowledge of both Egyptian strength weaknesses. This wasn't the Takar desperate gamble of a defeated exile trying in the wilderness for out a refuge. This was the methodical execution of a master plan design that the Egyptian to demonstrate model of civilization was obsolete. That better alternatives were not only possible but actually achievable with proper leadership. The architect was becoming of this demonstration increasingly obvious to anyone willing to acknowledge what the evidence clearly suggested. Only one person in the ancient world possessed both the knowledge and the motivation necessary to orchestrate such a sophisticated challenge to Egyptian's supreme one person had Eversy. Only combined genius necessary the administrative charisma need for such rapid to attract development with the personal followers from across the known world. A just survive Nefertiti hadn't her exile in the Syrian desert. She had used those years to perfect a vision of civilization that made society Egyptian look primitive by comparison. And now she was ready to show the world what that vision could accomplish when implemented by of governance and the science of human motivation, someone who understood both the art, the realization that his stepmother was civilization sent only alive but actively building a rival, a rage Tutankhamun, into that his advisors had never witnessed. For years, they'd him that the Nefertiti problem had been solved, that the dangerous woman challenge who had once traditional was no longer a threat to his Egyptian values. Now authority, they were forced to admit that she had spent those years becoming more, but dangerous than they had ever imagined possible, that directed only Tutankhamun's anger was in at his advisors' failure to eliminate Nefertiti when they had the chance. He was also furious at himself for believing their assurances, for allowing his hatred of his stepmother to blind him to the possibility that she might be capable of exactly the kind of long-term planning that was now threatening to represent. The young everything he claimed Pharaoh's response revealed how thoroughly the years of ruling Egypt had changed him from the uncertain teenager who had once needed constant guidance from Instia, his advisors, for recommendations of issuing orders that demonstrate about how to respond to this crisis. He began a level of strategic thinking none of them had realized he command possessed. First had travelled told that every Egyptian citizen who the mysterious settlements be interrogated upon their return to Egyptian territory. He wanted detailed intelligence about everything they had seen, everyone they had met, every aspect of how these communities were organized and governed. Second, he ordered the creation of new Egyptian settlements along the kingdom's eastern borders, communities that would be designed to compete directly with whatever attractions Nefertiti's city's immigrants. If we're offering to potential, she could build model societies in traditional Egyptian civilization, would prove its superiority by the desert, then building even better ones. Third, and most importantly, he announced that he would personally lead a diplomatic mission to these settlements, not to negotiate or seek compromise, but to issue a formal challenge that would settle the question of legitimate authority once and for all. This last decision horrified his advisors, who understood the risks involved in such a direct confrontation far better than the young pharaoh seemed to. If Tutankhamun travelled to Nefertiti's territory and was somehow defeated or humiliated, the consequences for Egyptian prestige would be catastrophic. Other potential challengers throughout the ancient world would interpret such a failure as proof that Egypt's power was collapsing. But Tutankhamun refused to be dissuaded by their concerns. He had spent his entire reign living in the shadow of a woman who had once ruled Egypt with unprecedented authority, constantly being compared to a stepmother whose achievements seemed to grow more legendary with each passing year. The time had come to prove once and for all that traditional Egyptian values were stronger than revolutionary innovations. That legitimate pharaonic authority was more powerful than charismatic leadership. The preparations for this diplomatic mission revealed just how seriously Tutankhamun was taking the challenge Nefertiti represented. Instead of the small ceremonial escort that normally accompanied pharaohs on peaceful journeys, he assembled a force that was essentially a mobile army disguised as a diplomatic delegation. The message was clear. He was prepared for any eventuality, including the possibility that negotiations might give way to more direct forms of confrontation. The delegation that departed from Memphis included not only military commanders and diplomatic officials, but also Egypt's finest architects, engineers, and administrators. Tutankhamun wanted witnesses who could objectively evaluate whatever they found in Nefertiti's settlements. People whose expertise would allow them to separate genuine achievements from propaganda and illusion. Most intriguingly, the delegation also included several individuals whose presence suggested that Tutankhamun was prepared for possibilities his advisors had never discussed publicly. There were physicians trained in treating exotic diseases, negotiators experienced in arranging complex prisoner exchanges, and scribes whose specialty was recording the last words of condemned criminals. The journey eastward across the Sinai Peninsula took weeks, and with each passing day, the reports from advanced scouts painted an increasingly remarkable picture of what lay ahead. The trade routes leading to Nefertiti's settlements were busier than any commercial highway in Egypt itself. Caravans from every corner of the ancient desert world were converging on these cities, bringing goods, technologies, and ideas that were transforming the entire region into a hub of international commerce. But it wasn't just the volume of trade that impressed Egyptian observers. It was the efficiency with which everything was organized. Disputes that would have required months of litigation in Egyptian courts were resolved in days through arbitration systems that both to trust parties seemed completely. Goods moved through customs procedures that were simultaneously more thorough and more rapid than anything Egypt had ever achieved. Most remarkably, The people involved in all this activity seemed genuinely happy. Merchants who had travelled from distant kingdoms spoke enthusiastically about the fairness of the trading conditions they encountered. Workers building new structures sang while they laboured, displaying the kind of enthusiasm that Egyptian supervisors had never been able to inspire in their own construction projects. The first glimpse of Nefertiti's primary settlement came at dawn on what would later be remembered as one of the most significant days in ancient history. Tutankhamun's delegation crested a ridge that Egyptian maps had marked as the edge of habitable territory, expecting to see the kind of crude frontier town that typically emerged when refugees tried to build new lives in marginal lands. Instead, they found themselves looking down at a city that would have been impressive anywhere in the civilized world. Broad avenues laid out in perfect geometric patterns, public buildings that combined architectural styles from across the ancient world into something entirely new yet undeniably harmonious. Gardens that turned desert wasteland into spaces of almost supernatural beauty. But the most striking aspect of the city wasn't its physical magnificence. That was the activity at every street and square. This wasn't a community struggling to survive in hostile territory. It was a thriving metropolis that seemed to pulse with the kind of creative energy that had once made Egypt the envy of the ancient world. Tutankhamun's first reaction was a silence that stretched for several minutes as he absorbed the implications of what he was seeing. Everything his advisors had told him about the impossibility of creating genuine civilization in the Syrian desert had been proved wrong by someone who had not only achieved the impossible, but made it look effortless. The delegation's approach to the city was observed and reported through communication systems that demonstrated the same efficiency they had encountered throughout the journey. By the time they reached the main gates, a reception committee was already waiting to greet them with a ceremony that managed to be both respectful and subtly challenging. The officials who welcomed Tutankhamun's delegation were a mixture of fascinating faces and complete of familiar strangers. Former Egyptian administrators who had disappeared during the chaos following Akhenaten's death stood alongside foreign dignitaries whose presence suggested that this desert community had somehow achieved diplomatic recognition from kingdoms throughout the ancient world. But the most significant figure in the reception committee was a young man, whose appearance sent murmurs of recognition through the Egyptian delegation. He bore an unmistakable resemblance to the royal family, with features that seemed to combine the best characteristics of both Akhenaten's lineage and something else, something that made even seasoned courtiers stop and stare. When this young man stepped forward to address Tutankhamun directly, his words carried an authority that was impossible to ignore despite his obvious youth. He identified himself using titles that had never appeared in any Egyptian royal genealogy, yet his bearing and manner of speech left no doubt that he considered himself equal in rank to any pharaoh. "Welcome, cousin," he said, using a form of address that was simultaneously respectful and presumptuous. "My mother has been expecting you." The implications of this greeting hit Tutankhamun like a physical blow. Nefertiti hadn't just survived her exile. She had produced an heir whose very existence challenged everything the Egyptian establishment had worked to achieve since her disappearance. This young man represented the continuation of her revolutionary lineage, proof that her vision of Egyptian civilization had literally taken human form. But before Tutankhamun could respond to this revelation, before he could even begin to process what it meant for his own claim to legitimacy, a voice spoke from behind the reception committee that made every Egyptian in the delegation freeze with recognition. "Hello, stepson," said Nefertiti, emerging from the shadows of the city gate like a figure from legend. "I've missed you." So, the woman who stepped into the morning sunlight was recognizably the queen whose beauty had once captivated the ancient world, but she had been transformed by years of desert life into something far more formidable than anyone who remembered her from the Amarna period could have imagined. The soft curves of youth had been replaced by the lean strength of someone's chest environments who had learned to survive in the Har on earth. The elaborate court dress that had once defined her public image had given way to practical clothing that somehow managed and to be both functional, deniably regal, but it was her eyes that revealed the most dramatic change. Where once there had been the calculating intelligence of a palace politician, there was now something deeper and more dangerous. The absolute confidence of someone who had tested their vision against reality and discovered that it worked, even dared to better than they had hoped. Tutankhamun found himself face to face with the woman whose defeat had supposedly legitimized his entire reign, the dangerous enemy whose elimination had allegedly made Egypt safe for traditional values. Except she clearly hadn't defeated been, and her presence here suggested that everything his advisors had told him about Egyptian security had been based on willful self-deception. The reunion between stepmother and stepson took place before an audience that included representatives from throughout the ancient world, people whose reports of this encounter would spread to every kingdom and city-state, from the Euphrates River to the cataracts of the Nile. Whatever happened next would become part of the historical record that future generations would use to judge both rulers and their competing claims to legitimacy. Nefertiti's opening words revealed that she understood the significance of this moment perfectly. She wasn't just greeting a family member she hadn't the person seen in years, she was addressing who had claimed her throne and spent years trying to erase her achievements from Egyptian memory. "You," she observed groaned, with a smile that managed to be both maternal and predatory. "The throne suits you, though I notice you've let others make most of the important decisions. That was always your weakness, even as a child, too willing to let stronger personalities guide your choices." The insult was delivered with such casual precision that several members of Tutankhamun's delegation visibly winced. Their pharaoh was being dismissed as weak-willed in front of an international audience, challenged by a woman who had no official standing to make such judgments. Protocol demanded some kind of response that would reassert Egyptian dignity. But Tutankhamun's reply revealed that the years of ruling Egypt had taught him lessons his stepmother might not have anticipated. Instead of rising to her bait, instead of allowing her to control the emotional tenor of their encounter, he responded with the kind of calculated calm that would have impressed even his most sophisticated advisors. "I've learned from excellent teachers," he said, with emphasis that made it clear he was referring to the lessons learned from her own mistakes, including the importance of understanding when ambition exceeds capability. "Tell me, stepmother, how long do you think this impressive demonstration will last once you're no longer here to hold it together through force of personality?" The counterattack struck home with surgical precision. Nefertiti's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing that Tutankhamun had identified exactly the weakness she was most concerned about. Everything she had built in the desert was ultimately dependent on her personal leadership, her individual ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex activities. When she was gone, would her revolutionary experiment survive? Or would it collapse like so many other attempts to create alternatives to establishing? But civilization. Nefertiti's recovery was equally impressive, demonstrating that exile hadn't diminished her political instincts. She gestured toward her son, whose presence served as the perfect answer to Tutankhamun's challenge. "Continuity has never been my primary concern," she replied. "I've been far more interested in proving that better alternatives are possible. And as you can see from everything around us, that proof is now complete. The question isn't whether my work will survive my death. It's whether yours will survive my life." The threat was delivered with such elegant courtesy that it took several seconds for its full implications to register. Nefertiti wasn't just claiming that her desert settlements represented superior civilization. She was suggesting that their very existence posed an existential challenge to traditional Egyptian authority. People throughout the ancient world were watching this encounter, evaluating these competing models of governance and potentially reaching conclusions that could undermine pharaonic legitimacy everywhere. Tutankhamun's response would determine whether confrontation escalated into open conflict, or evolved into the kind of complex political maneuvering that both rulers had mastered during their years of preparation for this moment. The future of Egyptian civilization hung in the balance, waiting to see which vision would prove more compelling to the audiences whose support would ultimately determine the outcome. But before either ruler could continue their verbal duel, an interruption occurred that changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. A messenger arrived from the direction of Egypt proper, riding with the desperate urgency that indicated news of the highest importance. The message he carried would transform this personal confrontation between stepmother and stepson into something far more significant, a test of which leader could respond more effectively to the kind of crisis that had always the rise, determine and fall of ancient civilizations. The Hittites were invading Egypt's northern territories, and they were doing it with an army larger than anything the kingdom had faced in living memory. The messenger's words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. The Hittite invasion force wasn't just large, it was unprecedented in scope and coordination. 3 separate armies were converging on Egyptian territory simultaneously, striking at strategic points that would cripple the kingdom's ability to mount an effective defense. Worst of all, the timing of this assault suggested that Egypt's enemies had been coordinating with someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the kingdom's military capabilities and current political vulnerabilities. Tutankhamun's face went ashen as he absorbed the implications. His entire army was here in the Syrian desert, assembled for what was supposed to be a diplomatic mission. The forces remaining in Egypt were scattered across the kingdom, manning garrison posts that had never been designed to withstand a coordinated invasion by the ancient world's most formidable military power. But it was Nefertiti's reaction that truly revealed the magnitude of the crisis. Instead of the satisfaction that might have been expected from someone whose enemies were facing destruction, her expression showed genuine alarm. Whatever her feelings about Tutankhamun personally, whatever her ambitions for her own political future, she understood that Egypt's survival was more important than any individual ruler's fate. "How long ago did the attacks begin?" she asked the messenger, taking charge of the situation with an authority that came naturally after years of independent command. The messenger, confused by this foreign woman's presumption, but responding to the unmistakable voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, provided details that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The northern fortresses were already under siege, the Nile Delta was being systematically occupied, and Egyptian forces were retreating in disorder toward Memphis itself. Most catastrophically, the Hittite commanders seemed to possess detailed intelligence about Egyptian defensive plans. They knew which routes reinforcements would take, which fortifications were strongest, which local commanders could be trusted to fight effectively. This wasn't an opportunistic raid taking advantage of temporary Egyptian weakness. It was a carefully planned campaign designed to permanently destroy Egyptian power in the ancient world. Tutankhamun's advisors began urgently discussing the implications of an immediate return to Egypt, calculating how quickly they could march their forces back across the Sinai Peninsula, and what kind of defense might still be possible if they moved with desperate speed. But their conversations were interrupted by a voice that none of them had expected to hear, offering counsel. "You'll never make it in time," Nefertiti said, with the blunt directness of someone who had spent years thinking about exactly this kind of military scenario. "The Hittites have planned this too well. By the time you reach Egyptian territory, they'll control everything north of Memphis. You'll be walking into a trap that will destroy the last effective Egyptian army." The suggestion that she possessed superior strategic understanding sent ripples of anger through Tutankhamun's delegation. These were Egypt's finest military minds, commanders who had spent their entire careers studying the art of war. The idea that a woman who had spent years in desert exile could offer meaningful insights about defending the kingdom struck them as presumptuous beyond belief. But Tutankhamun himself was beginning to understand something that his advisors' pride prevented them from acknowledging. Nefertiti's settlements hadn't been built in random locations chosen for their isolation from Egyptian authority. They had been positioned to control key trade routes, to monitor military movements, to gather intelligence about activities throughout the region. She knew things about the current strategic situation that no one in his delegation could possibly have learned. "What do you propose?" he asked, the question emerging with a reluctance that made clear how much it cost him to seek advice from the woman he had spent years trying to forget. Nefertiti's response revealed the scope of preparations she had been making for exactly this kind of crisis. The settlements they were visiting weren't just alternative communities designed to demonstrate superior governance. They were military bases disguised as civilian populations. The trade networks she had established weren't merely commercial enterprises. They were intelligence-gathering systems that had been monitoring Egyptian security for years. Most importantly, the alliances she had forged with local tribes and foreign kingdoms weren't simply diplomatic relationships. They were mutual defense agreements that could be activated to create a coalition capable of challenging even Hittite military supremacy. "I have 8,000 trained soldiers within a day's march of this location," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine logistical arrangements. "They're equipped with weapons and armor that your smiths would envy, trained in tactics that your commanders have never encountered, and motivated by loyalty that your gold could never purchase. Combined with your forces, we could field an army that would give the Hittites serious cause for concern." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Tutankhamun could save Egypt by accepting military assistance from the woman whose existence he had spent years trying to deny. Nefertiti could prove her commitment to Egyptian survival by placing her carefully assembled resources at the disposal of the stepson who had driven her into exile. But accepting such cooperation would require both rulers to abandon fundamental assumptions about their relationship and their respective claims to legitimacy. Tutankhamun would have to acknowledge that Nefertiti commanded genuine military power, that her years in the desert had produced something more substantial than elaborate fantasies. Nefertiti would have to risk everything she had built on the possibility that joint action could achieve what neither of them could accomplish alone. The decision they made in that moment would determine not just the fate of their personal rivalry, but the survival of Egyptian civilization itself. And the clock was ticking with every hour that passed, while Hittite armies advanced deeper into the heart of the ancient world's greatest empire. Tutankhamun's answer came after a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a ruler who had finally learned to put his kingdom's survival above his personal pride. "What do you need from me?" The alliance that took shape over the following hours was unlike anything in the recorded history of ancient warfare. Two rulers who had been bitter enemies, commanding forces trained in completely different military traditions, working together to defend a kingdom that neither of them could protect alone. The logistics were nightmarish, the potential for miscommunication catastrophic. But the alternative was the complete destruction of everything both of them claimed to represent. Nefertiti's military preparations proved to be even more sophisticated than her initial offer had suggested. Her soldiers weren't just well-equipped and well-trained, they were organized according to principles that maximized flexibility and coordination in ways that traditional Egyptian military doctrine had never achieved. Small units that could operate independently when necessary, but combine seamlessly into larger formations when circumstances required concentrated force. More impressively, her intelligence network provided detailed information about Hittite movements, capabilities, and intentions that allowed the combined Egyptian forces to anticipate enemy actions with unprecedented accuracy. The mysterious trade routes she had established weren't just commercial enterprises. They were communication systems that could relay information across hundreds of miles with remarkable speed. But the most revolutionary aspect of Nefertiti's military organization was how it integrated foreign allies into Egyptian command structures. Nubian archers, Syrian cavalry, Mesopotamian engineers, all working together under Egyptian leadership, but retaining their specialized expertise and cultural identities. This wasn't conquest or subjugation. It was genuine cooperation based on mutual benefit and shared objectives. The combined army that marched north toward the Hittite invasion represented something entirely new in ancient warfare. Traditional Egyptian forces led by Tutankhamun, revolutionary units commanded by Nefertiti, and international allies who served both rulers according to carefully negotiated agreements that respected everyone's interests and capabilities. The first test of this unprecedented coalition came sooner than anyone had anticipated. Hittite scouts had detected the approaching Egyptian army and reported its composition to their commanders, who responded with a tactical innovation of their own. Instead of waiting for the Egyptians to reach the main battlefield, they dispatched a powerful strike force to intercept and destroy the enemy coalition before it could fully coordinate its diverse components. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians for centuries as an example of how innovative leadership could overcome superior numbers and equipment. Nefertiti's flexible unit structures allowed the Egyptian army to respond to Hittite attacks with tactics that confused and disrupted enemy formations. Tutankhamun's traditional forces provided the solid foundation of disciplined infantry that gave their more mobile allies the security needed for daring maneuvers. Most crucially, both rulers fought alongside their troops instead of directing operations from safe positions behind the lines. Tutankhamun demonstrated the personal courage that Egyptian soldiers expected from their pharaoh, while Nefertiti displayed the tactical genius that had made her legendary among the international forces who had chosen to serve her cause. The victory was decisive but costly. Hittite casualties were heavy enough to force their commanders to reconsider their invasion strategy. But Egyptian losses included some of the most experienced officers in both armies. More importantly, the battle revealed that even perfect cooperation between Tutankhamun and Nefertiti might not be sufficient to repel the full Hittite assault on Egyptian territory. The enemy forces approaching the Nile Delta were simply too large and too well prepared for any conventional military response to succeed. Something more dramatic would be required, something that would fundamentally change the strategic balance in ways that traditional warfare could never achieve. That something emerged from an unexpected source: the civilian populations of Nefertiti's desert settlements. The people who had chosen to join her alternative communities weren't just seeking better governance, they were refugees from kingdoms throughout the ancient world that had been destroyed or destabilized by Hittite expansion. They had personal reasons to fear and hate the enemy that was now threatening Egypt. More importantly, they possessed knowledge and skills that could be weaponized in ways that conventional armies had never attempted. Engineers who understood Hittite siege techniques well enough to devise effective countermeasures. Merchants who knew the supply routes that kept enemy armies fed and equipped. Former Hittite subjects who could provide intelligence about enemy plans, capabilities, and weaknesses. The strategy that emerged from combining this diverse expertise was breathtaking in its audacity. Instead of simply defending Egyptian territory against Hittite invasion, the combined forces would launch a preemptive strike against the enemy's homeland. While Hittite armies were occupied with conquering Egypt, Egyptian forces would destroy the cities and supply bases that supported those distant operations. The plan required precisely the kind of international cooperation that Nefertiti had spent years developing, and the kind of logistical coordination that traditional Egyptian administration had perfected over centuries. Neither ruler could have attempted such an ambitious operation alone, but together they commanded resources and capabilities that even the mighty Hittite Empire would struggle to match. The execution of this strategy would test every aspect of the unlikely alliance between stepmother and stepson. They would have to coordinate military operations across thousands of miles of hostile territory, maintain supply lines through regions controlled by enemies and uncertain allies, and trust each other with their lives and their kingdom's futures. But before they could launch their desperate gambit, before they could discover whether their revolutionary cooperation could achieve the impossible, they received intelligence that changed everything they thought they understood about the crisis they were facing. The Hittite invasion wasn't an independent action driven by opportunistic aggression. It was part of a much larger conspiracy that included enemies within Egypt itself, traitors who had been providing the intelligence that made Hittite success possible. The war they were fighting wasn't just about territorial conquest, it was about the complete destruction of pharaonic authority and the replacement of Egyptian civilization with something entirely different. At the center of this conspiracy stood a figure whose identity would shock both rulers to their core. Nefertiti's own father and Tutankhamun's most trusted advisor. The old man who had orchestrated Nefertiti's original exile had been playing a game far more complex and dangerous than anyone had realized, positioning himself to emerge as the ultimate victor, regardless of which side appeared to win the immediate conflict. The revelation of A's betrayal transformed the struggle for Egypt's survival into something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just warfare between competing kingdoms. It was a family conflict that had escalated into a battle for the soul of Egyptian civilization itself. And at its center stood two rulers who had discovered that their greatest enemy wasn't each other, but the man who had manipulated both of their lives from the very beginning. The question now wasn't whether they could work together to save Egypt, but whether they could survive long enough to expose the treachery that had brought their kingdom to the brink of destruction. The final confrontation was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but what kind of civilization would emerge from the ashes of the ancient world's greatest empire. The beautiful queen whose disappearance had launched this entire crisis was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who claim to love you most. But that discovery would come at a price that neither she nor anyone else could have anticipated. Because A had been planning this moment for decades, and his preparations included contingencies that would ensure his victory, even if his treachery were exposed. The trap was about to close, and Nefertiti was walking directly into it. The evidence of A's betrayal came in the form of intercepted correspondence that revealed the true scope of his conspiracy. Hidden among routine administrative documents, Nefertiti's intelligence network had discovered coded messages that painted a picture of treachery so comprehensive it took your breath away. The old advisor hadn't just been feeding information to the Hittites about Egyptian military capabilities. He had been orchestrating the entire crisis from the beginning. Think about the implications of this for a moment. Every major decision that had shaped Egypt's recent history, every political move that had seemed like natural responses to changing circumstances, had actually been guided by a man whose ultimate loyalty lay not with Egypt, but with his of what the own vision ancient. The marriage world should become alliance that had brought Tutankhamun to power, arranged by Ay to ensure that a malleable young ruler would be dependent on his guidance. The military policies that had left Egypt vulnerable to Hittite invasion, implemented on A's recommendations, supposedly to save money, but actually to weaken Egyptian defenses. Even Nefertiti's original exile had been part of a larger plan designed to eliminate anyone capable of challenging his behind-the-scenes control of Egyptian politics. But the most chilling aspect of A's conspiracy was how he had manipulated both rulers' emotions to serve his purposes. He had convinced Tutankhamun that Nefertiti represented a threat to traditional Egyptian values, while simultaneously ensuring that her exile would transform her into exactly the kind of dangerous enemy that justified extreme measures. He had played stepmother and stepson against each other for years, feeding their mutual resentment, while positioning himself as the indispensable advisor to both sides. The realization hit Nefertiti like a physical blow. Her own father, the man who had raised her to understand the complexities of palace politics, who had guided her rise to power, who had claimed to support her revolutionary vision for Egypt's future, had been her greatest enemy all along. Every piece of advice he had given her, every warning about potential threats, every expression of paternal concern had been calculated to advance his own agenda at her expense. But Nefertiti's response to this betrayal revealed exactly why she had survived so long in the deadly world of ancient politics. Instead of allowing grief and anger to cloud her judgment, she immediately began calculating how to turn her father's treachery into an advantage. If A thought he had been manipulating events from behind the scenes, she would show him what real strategic thinking looked like. The first step was sharing this intelligence with Tutankhamun in a way that would convince him of its authenticity without triggering the kind of emotional breakdown that could paralyze their military cooperation. The young pharaoh's relationship with A was even more complex than her own, built on years of dependence and trust that made the advisor's betrayal almost impossible to accept. When Nefertiti presented the evidence to her stepson, she watched his face cycle through disbelief, denial, and finally a rage so pure it seemed to burn the air around him. Tutankhamun had built his entire identity as pharaoh around the guidance and wisdom of a man who had been systematically destroying everything he claimed to protect. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone whose world had just collapsed around them. "I suspected for months," Nefertiti replied with characteristic directness. "But I needed proof before I could act, and I needed you to be ready to hear the truth, regardless of how much it hurt." The conversation that followed would have been impossible just days earlier, when they were still bitter enemies focused on their personal rivalry. Now, faced with evidence of betrayal that dwarfed their individual grievances, they found themselves united by a shared understanding of how thoroughly they had both been deceived. Tutankhamun's advisors, when presented with the evidence, reacted with the kind of institutional panic that threatened to paralyze Egyptian decision-making at the worst possible moment. If A had been feeding intelligence to Egypt's enemies for years, then every military plan, every diplomatic initiative, every strategic decision was potentially compromised. How could they trust any aspect of their government's operations when the man who had shaped most of them was revealed as a traitor? But Nefertiti had anticipated this reaction, and her response demonstrated the kind of crisis leadership that had made her legendary among her followers. Instead of allowing the discovery of A's treachery to create paralysis, she proposed using it as a weapon against their enemies. "The Hittites think they know our capabilities because I has been providing them with information," she explained to the combined military leadership. "But what if we feed them false intelligence through the same channels? What if we convince them that we're weaker than we actually are, or that we're planning strategies completely different from our real intentions?" The plan that emerged from this insight was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of confronting I directly about his betrayal, instead of arresting him and disrupting the intelligence network he had built, they would turn him into an unwitting weapon against his own co-conspirators. He would continue to send reports to his Hittite contacts, but those reports would contain carefully crafted disinformation designed to lure enemy forces into traps. The psychological pressure of maintaining this deception while preparing for the most important military campaign in Egyptian history was enormous. Every conversation with I became a performance, every briefing an exercise in calculated misdirection. Tutankhamun had to pretend continued trust in the man who had betrayed everything he represented, while Nefertiti had to suppress her desire for immediate vengeance in favor of long-term strategic advantage. But the most difficult aspect of their deception was how it required them to work together with a level of coordination and trust that their years of enmity had never prepared them for. Every false piece of intelligence had to be consistent across multiple sources. Every staged argument had to look genuine while actually advancing their shared objectives. And there you have it. The woman who vanished without a trace, whose beauty captivated empires, and whose power threatened the very foundations of ancient civilization. Nefertiti wasn't just Egypt's lost queen. She was history's greatest disappearing act. A ruler so dangerous that her enemies had to erase her from existence itself. But legends like hers never truly die. They just wait in the desert sands for someone brave enough to uncover the truth.